May 1940. France, Britain, and their allies held more troops, more tanks, and more guns than Germany. Their generals believed the Battle of France could only end in Allied victory. After all, the French army was the strongest on the continent, faced by just 16 German motorized divisions and a defensive lull called the Blitzkrieg. Yet in just 46 days, the Germans shattered that confidence, broke through the least defended sector, and forced France's collapse. How did a force smaller on paper overturn Europe's military balance? And what invisible flaw left the Allies so exposed? The answer begins with a single blind spot, and the consequences would upend the course of the entire war. On paper, the Allies entered the spring of 1940 with every advantage. France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands fielded nearly 3.7 million troops, close to 1 million more than the German forces deployed on the Western Front. Their combined arsenal included 14,000 guns and 3,700 tanks, numbers that dwarfed the German totals of 7,500 artillery pieces and 2,700 tanks and self-propelled guns. France alone, considered Europe's strongest land army, had more tanks than the Germans, and many of them, like the Char B-1 and the Saumur S-35, were heavier and better armoured than most panzers. The British Expeditionary Force, though smaller, brought a modern, well-trained professional corps. Belgian and Dutch units added further depth to the Allied order of battle, swelling the number of divisions available to more than 140. The Allies' edge extended to the air. Their air forces counted nearly 3,000 aircraft, including hundreds of modern fighters and bombers, while the Luftwaffe committed around 4,000 planes, though not all were operational or based in the West. Allied planners took comfort in these statistics, convinced that material superiority and a strong defensive doctrine would hold the line against any German attack. French inventories listed thousands of anti-tank guns, and the Maginot Line's fortifications promised to anchor the main front. Supply ledgers tallied mountains of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts stockpiled behind the lines. Yet, for all the numbers, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. From September 1939 until May 1940, the so-called Blitzkrieg, what British soldiers called the Phony War, settled over northern France and Belgium. Both armies waited. French and British units manned their posts, drilled, and watched the border. Reports from the front described weeks of boredom, punctuated by brief artillery exchanges and reconnaissance patrols. Civilians returned to their routines, and the sense of looming crisis faded into a kind of uneasy routine. The quiet masked deeper problems. Allied forces, spread thin to cover Belgium and the north, left the Ardennes and other sectors to second-line divisions. The French 7th Army, intended as a mobile reserve, was instead sent north to support the Dutch. The British, though well-equipped, had only 10 divisions on the continent at the start of the campaign. Most French and Belgian units were made up of reservists mobilized after September, men with limited training, led by officers whose experience came from the last war. Equipment tables showed impressive totals, but much of the Allied arsenal dated from the previous conflict. Many French tanks lacked radios, and their artillery doctrine favored static defense over rapid support. Behind the front, Allied staff officers drew confidence from their ledgers. The numbers seemed to guarantee security, reinforcing a belief that the next battle would be fought on terms of their choosing. Yet the long lull bred complacency, and the logic of deployment designed for a repeat of 1914 left little room for surprise. The Allies' overwhelming strength on paper became its own kind of blind spot, masking the vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed. French war planners called it Plan D, or the Dial Plan, a strategy built on speed and confidence. The moment a German attack began, French and British armies would surge forward into Belgium, aiming to set up a strong defensive line along the Dial and Meuse rivers, well inside Belgian territory. This forward deployment was meant to keep the fight away from French soil and to reassure Belgium, whose neutrality made pre-war coordination nearly impossible. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, anchored his entire plan on the belief that the main German thrust would come through central Belgium, just as it had in 1914. The best French and British units, mechanized, well-equipped, and battle-ready, were committed northward, racing to positions near Gembloux, Louvain, and the Albert Canal. The French 7th Army, their only real strategic reserve, was sent even further, toward the Dutch border, to link up with Dutch forces near Breda. In theory, this left no major reserve behind the main front. But the plan had a blind spot. South of the main Allied concentration, the Ardennes region, dense forests, steep hills, and narrow roads, was judged by French staff studies to be impassable to tanks and large formations. Marshal Pétain had called the Ardennes impenetrable. Gamelin himself described it as Europe's best tank obstacle. French war games in 1938 had even tested a German attack through the Ardennes. The defending forces collapsed in the simulation, but the results were quietly ignored. The staff concluded that, at worst, any German force would take at least 5 days to cross the forest and another week to reach the Meuse. Only second-line units, like the 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions, mostly reservists with outdated equipment, were assigned to cover the Meuse crossings at Sedan and further south. No serious contingency plan existed for a rapid German breakthrough here. The Maginot Line's western extension ended short of Sedan, replaced by a patchwork of unfinished bunkers and field fortifications. Communications were thin, and anti-tank defenses were incomplete. French intelligence reports in the spring of 1940, including aerial sightings of major German movements in the Ardennes, were dismissed as minor diversions. The High Command trusted the terrain more than their own reconnaissance. As French and British forces poured into Belgium, the southern flank, the hinge between the fortified Maginot Line and the main Allied armies, remained exposed. The logic of Plan D, built on the last war's lessons, left a critical gap right where the German armoured columns would soon strike. The fate of France now rested on a stretch of forest and a river line guarded by men who, on paper, were never meant to face the main enemy blow. In November 1939, the mood inside the German High Command's war rooms was tense and uncertain. Hitler, impatient after the swift victory in Poland, demanded an immediate attack in the west. His generals, led by Chief of the Army General Staff Franz Halder, saw only disaster in such haste. Halder's own war diary from December lays out the grim arithmetic. He projected up to 500,000 German casualties if they struck at France and the Low Countries before spring. The army, still digesting the campaign in Poland, lacked the reserves and logistical depth for another major offensive. Halder's staff, cautious by both temperament and experience, began drafting a plan that looked much like the old Schlieffen plan, another massive sweep through central Belgium, aiming to outflank the French and drive toward the Channel coast. But the numbers did not inspire confidence. The plan called for a broad front advance, with the main weight of the German attack swinging north of the Ardennes through the open country between Liège and Antwerp. Halder's calculations showed that, even if the Germans broke through, they would face the full might of the French and British armies, reinforced by Belgian and Dutch units. The likelihood of a quick, decisive victory seemed remote. The General Staff's forecasts were bleak: heavy losses, a long war of attrition, and no guarantee of success. Arguments erupted in Berlin. Halder and his colleagues insisted that the army was not ready. They pointed to the shortages of trucks and fuel, the unfinished mobilization of new divisions, and the logistical nightmare of moving hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles across the muddy roads of the Low Countries in winter. Hitler, however, would not be swayed. He dismissed the general's fears as defeatism and pressed for action, convinced that Britain and France would only grow stronger as time passed. The friction between Hitler and his senior officers grew sharper by the week. Halder, under immense pressure, considered resignation. At one point, he even discussed the possibility of removing Hitler by force, a thought he quickly abandoned as unrealistic. The deadlock in Berlin was more than just a clash of personalities. It exposed a fundamental rift between Hitler's appetite for risk and the army's instinct for caution. The generals, shaped by the bloodletting of the last war, saw only the dangers of a premature offensive. Hitler, increasingly isolated from his commanders, believed that boldness and speed were the keys to victory. As winter set in, the debate dragged on. Orders to prepare for an attack would be issued, only to be cancelled days later. Each time, Halder's staff revised their plans, but the basic concept remained unchanged: a frontal assault through Belgium, with little room for surprise or operational finesse. The sense of paralysis deepened. The army's planners knew they needed a new approach, but the path forward was anything but clear. In the standoff between Hitler's impatience and the General Staff's caution, the seeds of innovation and further discord were quietly taking root. On January 10th, 1940, a German courier plane crash lands near Mechelon-sur-Meuse in Belgium. On board are secret documents detailing the German operational plan for an invasion through central Belgium, a plan that closely resembles the old Schlieffen maneuver. Belgian authorities seize the documents. News of the breach reaches Berlin within hours. Panic spreads through the German high command. Hitler, already frustrated by months of delays and wary of repeating the First World War's mistakes, demands a complete overhaul. The old plan is now considered compromised. Inside the German staff, arguments flare. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, clings to his cautious approach: a broad front attack through Belgium, with the main weight swinging north. But the Mechelon incident changes the equation. For Halder and his colleagues, the risk of the Allies preparing for a known plan is unacceptable. The pressure to innovate grows. In the background, Erich von Manstein, recently sidelined from Army Group A's staff, continues to push his alternative. A concentrated thrust through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse at Sedan, and racing for the Channel. On February 17, 1940, Manstein finally gets his audience with Hitler at a luncheon for new corps commanders. He lays out the logic. The Allies expect a repeat of 1914. Their best armies are committed north, leaving the Ardennes thinly held. A sudden strike through the forest could catch them off guard. Hitler listens intently. The next day, Halder, sensing the shifting winds, presents a revised outline that incorporates Manstein's core ideas, though with some hesitation about the scale of the gamble. The new operational directive, issued as Aufmarschanweisung No. 4 on February 24, 1940, is clear. Army Group B will pin Allied forces in Belgium and the Netherlands, but the real blow comes from Army Group A. 7 Panzer and motorized divisions, led by Guderian and Kleist, will push through the Ardennes, force the Meuse between Sedan and Dinant, and drive for Abbeville on the Channel. The aim is not just to break through, but to encircle the main Allied armies before they can react. This plan is a revolution in German military thinking. It concentrates the army's limited armor. Less than a fifth of all divisions are motorized into a narrow, risky corridor. The flanks are exposed, the roads are few and winding, but the promise of surprise and speed outweighs the risk. Force allocations shift overnight. Panzer divisions and motorized infantry are pulled from the north and reassigned to Army Group A. Orders and memos fly between headquarters. The Luftwaffe is tasked with supporting the river crossings and suppressing French artillery. By early March, the new plan is locked in. Commanders study the updated maps. The final directive leaves no doubt. The main effort will now come through the Ardennes. The old, cautious advance through Belgium has been set aside. With the operational green light, the Wehrmacht prepares for a campaign that will test every assumption about modern war. On May 10, 1940, German forces unleashed a carefully orchestrated assault across the borders of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The attack began before dawn, with paratroopers and glider-borne sappers landing atop Fort Eben-Emael, the most formidable fortress in Belgium. In less than 36 hours, a garrison of over 1,000 Belgian defenders was overwhelmed by just 78 German engineers, who used shaped charges and flamethrowers to neutralize the fortress's artillery. The fall of Eben-Emael on May 11th stunned Allied commanders, who had considered the fort the linchpin of the Albert Canal defenses. While the fortress was still under siege, German airborne and motorized units raced to secure key bridges at Vroonhoven and Veldwezelt, using surprise and speed to prevent demolition. Dutch defenders faced similar tactics as German commandos in captured uniforms seized crossings and airfields, sowing confusion behind the lines. In Rotterdam, German paratroopers failed to secure all objectives, but the threat of further bombing forced the Dutch government to capitulate after the destruction of the city's center on May 14th. By the next morning, Dutch resistance ended, and the Netherlands surrendered unconditionally, just 5 days after the invasion began. The rapid collapse of Dutch defenses and the breach at Eben-Emael triggered the full implementation of Allied Plan D. French and British armies surged into Belgium, aiming to establish a defensive line along the Dyle and Meuse rivers. The British Expeditionary Force advanced toward Louvain, while French mechanized units pushed to Gembloux and Wavre. The French 7th Army sped north toward Breda, hoping to link up with Dutch forces and block the German advance. Roads became clogged with military convoys and civilian refugees, stretching columns for miles and slowing the Allied deployment. German feints and airborne landings convinced Allied commanders that the main thrust was unfolding in the Low Countries. The best French and British units, including nearly all available armor, were drawn northward in response. Behind the front, the Ardennes remained lightly held by second-line French divisions. As the Allies committed their reserves to the Belgian plain, German Army Group A's armored columns pushed through the forest to the south, moving largely undetected. By May 12th, the Allies had fully taken the bait. Their forward deployment left the southern flank exposed, with the main mobile reserve already committed far from the point of greatest danger. The German diversion in the north had worked. The Allied armies were now locked in a race toward a front that would soon dissolve beneath them. On May 13th, 1940, German assault teams began crossing the Meuse at Sedan and Dinant. The French 55th Infantry Division, holding the critical sector at Sedan, faced the full weight of the German attack. General Henri-Jean Lafontaine commanded roughly 13,000 reservists, most over 30, spread thin across a line of 103 pillboxes and bunkers manned by the 147th Fortress Infantry Regiment. Artillery support was substantial on paper, 174 tubes assigned to the division, but training had been neglected in favor of months spent pouring concrete and digging trenches. The division's command post sat 8 kilometers behind the river, at Fond d'Agout, isolated from the front line by both distance and doctrine. German engineers and infantry, shielded by smoke and the ruins of Sedan, launched their crossing under the cover of a 9-hour Luftwaffe bombardment. Stuka dive bombers and level bombers struck French positions in relentless waves, flying nearly 4,000 sorties that day. The physical damage was surprisingly light, 56 French casualties in the bombardment. But the psychological effect was devastating. Gunners and infantry abandoned their posts, convinced the sky itself was falling. Many bunkers along the Meuse survived intact, but their crews melted away or lost contact with neighboring positions as telephone lines were cut and runners failed to return. The defensive line had a fatal flaw, a 1.5-kilometer gap at Gaulier, where no bunkers had been built. German assault boats landed here almost unopposed, quickly establishing a bridgehead. By evening, panic spread to the Bolson Ridge, 10 kilometers behind the river, where the 295th Regiment held the final prepared fallback line. False reports of German tanks, transmitted by a single artillery observer, triggered mass hysteria. The regiment broke and fled, abandoning their positions and heavy guns, though no German armor had yet crossed the river. Colonel Poncelet, the artillery commander, reluctantly ordered a retreat. He would later take his own life, unable to reconcile the collapse with his duty. As night fell, the chain of command disintegrated. Lafontaine moved his headquarters to Bolson, only to find his defense already gone. Communication with X-Corps and neighboring units failed. The division's artillery, deprived of observation and support, limbered up and joined the rout. By dawn, on May 14th, the German bridgehead had expanded. The 1st Panzers crossed the Meuse at 7:20 a.m., 12 hours after the French line had already unraveled. Attempts at counterattack by the 4th and 7th Tank Battalions using FCM-36 tanks were piecemeal and quickly repulsed. The 213th Infantry, the division's last reserve, could not stem the tide. Within 48 hours, the 55th Infantry Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Out of 13,000 men, most were neither killed nor wounded, but simply lost, scattered, captured, or in flight. The gap at Sedan opened the road west. German armored columns poured through, racing toward the channel. The collapse of one undertrained, undermanned division at Sedan sealed the fate of the French campaign. The Meuse, once considered Europe's best tank obstacle, had been crossed in less than 3 days. The decisive breach was not only physical, but psychological, exposing the vulnerabilities of doctrine, leadership, and morale under modern fire. On May 20th, 1940, German armored columns reached Abbeville, closing the trap along the Channel coast. In just 10 days, the panzers had crossed the Meuse, broken through at Sedan, and driven more than 200 kilometers west, splitting the Allied armies in two. The link-up at the mouth of the Somme cut off the British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and the Belgian Army from the rest of France. Over 1 million Allied troops now found themselves encircled in the north, hemmed in by the sea and German spearheads. The speed of the advance stunned Allied commanders. Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps led the charge, pushing his tanks and motorized infantry relentlessly forward, often beyond the limits of their own supply lines. His war diary for May 20th records the moment. At 8:30 p.m., the reconnaissance battalion reached the Channel at Noël-sur-Mer. That evening, German troops could see the water, proof the corridor had been sealed. The shock inside the Allied High Command was immediate. For weeks, French and British staff officers had believed that their strongest forces in Belgium would be able to wheel south and block any German thrust. Now, with the coast behind them, those same armies found themselves surrounded. The only remaining link to the rest of France was a narrow corridor running through Lille and Arras, already threatened by German advances from the south and east. The attempt to break out came swiftly. On May 21st, British and French units launched a counterattack south of Arras. The British 50th Division and 2 battalions of Matilda tanks, supported by French armour under Charles de Gaulle, struck Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. The attack gained ground at first, with Matildas shrugging off German anti-tank fire and punching through the lead elements. But the Germans quickly brought up 88mm flak guns, firing over open sights, and halted the advance. The Arras counterattack forced Rommel to pull back and caused temporary confusion in the German command, but it failed to reopen the corridor or slow the overall advance to the sea. For the Allies trapped north of the Somme, the situation grew more desperate by the hour. Communications with Paris broke down as German units pushed west and north, severing telephone lines and overrunning staff headquarters. Corps diaries from the French First Army record frantic orders to regroup and hold the line along the Lys and the Escaut, but the rapid German movement made coordinated defense nearly impossible. Most Allied units, exhausted from days of retreat and constant air attack, were forced to abandon heavy equipment and move on foot, often under strafing runs from the Luftwaffe. De Gaulle, commanding the newly formed 4th Armoured Division, attempted a counterstroke at Montcornet on May 17th and again at Abbeville on May 28th, but his tanks, lacking infantry and air support, could not hold their gains. These attacks, though spirited, did little to relieve the northern pocket. Guderian's columns pressed on, driving up the coast toward Boulogne and Calais, tightening the ring around the trapped Allied armies. The scale of the encirclement now became clear. More than 1 million Allied troops, including the entire British Expeditionary Force and the best French divisions, were cut off from the rest of France. The only hope lay in holding a shrinking perimeter along the Channel ports. As German panzers reached the outskirts of Boulogne and Calais, and the Luftwaffe hammered the roads to Dunkirk, the race to evacuate began in earnest. The trap was sprung, and the fate of the Allied armies in the north would depend on what could be saved from the encirclement. At dawn on May 26, 1940, ships began arriving off Dunkirk's beaches. British destroyers, French torpedo boats, minesweepers, and hundreds of civilian craft, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure yachts joined the effort. Over the next 9 days, this ad hoc armada would pull off what seemed impossible: the evacuation of 338,226 Allied troops from a shrinking perimeter under constant fire. Of these, 193,000 were British and 145,000 French, with a handful of Belgians and Poles. The port itself was under relentless Luftwaffe attack, its quays shattered and oil tanks burning, so most troops waited in long lines on the sand, wading out to be picked up by shallow draft boats and ferried to larger ships anchored offshore. The operation came at a steep price. 20 Royal Navy warships and over 200 smaller vessels were sunk by bombs, torpedoes, and mines. The Royal Air Force lost 145 aircraft defending the skies above the beaches. On land, the cost was even higher. Nearly 88,000 men, most of them French, remained behind to hold the perimeter. Their stand allowed the evacuation to continue, but ended in surrender. The 12th Motorized Infantry Division and the 150th Infantry Regiment fought until the final hours, their last positions overrun on June 4th. Many regimental colours were burned to prevent capture. The Belgian army, encircled and exhausted, capitulated on May 28th. King Leopold III surrendered unconditionally, taking personal command of the decision. His government fled to France, but the Belgian collapse left a gaping hole in the Allied line. With the northern flank gone and German forces pressing from 3 sides, the Dunkirk perimeter shrank to a thin strip of sand and ruined buildings. The British rearguard boarded the last ships on June 3rd. The French held on for another day, their evacuation ending at 3:40 a.m. on June 4th. In total, the Royal Navy and French Navy rescued nearly 200,000 men from the beaches and another 140,000 from the harbour's battered piers. Yet the miracle of Dunkirk was not without its shadows. The evacuation left behind all heavy weapons, vehicles, and supplies. Over 2,400 artillery pieces, 445 tanks, and nearly 65,000 vehicles were abandoned. British and French forces lost the backbone of their material, and the German army captured enough equipment to re-equip dozens of divisions. Naval losses were severe. 6 British and 3 French destroyers were sunk, along with scores of trawlers and launches. French units played a decisive role in the defense. General Bertrand Fagalda's 16th Corps organized the final rearguard, and Colonel Charles Bilotte's 12th Motorized Infantry Division, holding the eastern sector, absorbed the heaviest attacks. Their sacrifice bought time for the evacuation's final phase. Many French soldiers, denied evacuation, joined the long columns of prisoners bound for Germany. In total, over 1.8 million French troops would go into captivity by the end of June. The Dunkirk evacuation did not end the campaign, but it preserved the core of Britain's army and a nucleus of French fighting men. With the Channel now the only barrier, the fate of the war shifted from the beaches of northern France to the skies above Britain and the fields south of the Loire. For the Allies, Dunkirk was both a rescue and a reckoning. A narrow escape bought with ships, guns, and the lives of those who could not be saved. At dawn on June 5, 1940, German artillery opened fire along the Somme and Aisne. The second phase of the campaign, known as Case Red, began with a thunder of shells and the roar of engines. French troops, battered but not broken, braced for the renewed assault. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin as commander-in-chief just days earlier, ordered his armies to dig in and hold ground at all costs. The defensive doctrine now called for a series of hedgehog positions, strong points built around towns and villages, each designed to resist encirclement and buy time, even if cut off. French soldiers, many now fighting on home soil for the first time, manned these improvised fortresses with whatever weapons and ammunition remained. The German plan had changed. Instead of a single armored thrust, Army Groups A and B would attack together across a broad front. Panzer divisions, backed by infantry and air support, probed for weak spots from the Channel coast to the Swiss border. The French, short on reserves and exhausted from weeks of retreat, faced the full weight of the Wehrmacht without the benefit of prepared lines or a strategic reserve. Weygand's hedgehog tactics slowed the German advance in places like Amiens, Abbeville, and the Forêt de Compiègne. In the first days, some French units, supported by British and Polish contingents, fought off repeated attacks, forcing German commanders to adapt. At Péronne and Roye, French machine gunners held out for days, surrounded but refusing to surrender. But the Germans learned quickly. Rather than waste time on costly frontal assaults, they bypassed the strongest points, encircling and isolating defenders with armor and mobile infantry. The Luftwaffe, now operating with near-total air superiority, bombed roads, bridges and rail lines, disrupting French attempts to redeploy or reinforce threatened sectors. The pace of the German advance picked up as the panzers found open ground south of the Somme. By June 7, German spearheads had crossed the Aisne in multiple places. The French 10th and 7th armies, stretched thin and lacking reserves, could not plug the widening gaps. Reports from the front described columns of refugees and retreating soldiers clogging every road south. Despite these setbacks, resistance persisted. At Abbeville, French colonial troops, Senegalese tirailleurs, held out against tanks and infantry for nearly a week, repelling wave after wave until their ammunition ran out. In the Champagne region, the 14th Infantry Division, reinforced by remnants of armoured units, mounted a counterattack near Rethel, briefly halting the German advance and destroying several tanks. Weygand, visiting the front, encouraged his commanders to hold fast, insisting, "We must not let the enemy pass." Yet the German adaptation was relentless. By June 9th, Guderian's panzers crossed the Seine at Rouen and Les Andelys, threatening Paris from the northwest. Army Group B, having forced crossings at the Oise and Marne, pressed toward the capital from the northeast. French units, outflanked and isolated, faced impossible odds. The Hedgehog defenses, while stubborn, could only delay the inevitable. German columns fanned out, capturing town after town, the front dissolving into pockets of resistance and retreating columns. The French command, desperate for reinforcements, found little left to send. As the Germans closed in on Paris, the government declared the city open to spare it destruction. On June 14th, German troops entered the capital. In less than 10 days, the front had collapsed from the Channel to the Alps. Yet even as defeat loomed, pockets of French and colonial troops continued to resist, fighting village by village, determined to hold out as long as possible. The exhausted remnants of the French army, battered but not broken in spirit, faced the grim reality of defeat, even as Weygand's hedgehogs slowed the German tide, if only for a moment. At dawn on June 22, 1940, French delegates arrived at Rethel to sign the armistice. Marshal Philippe Pétain, now head of state, called for an end to fighting, stating that the heart must cease to beat. 3 days later, at 12:35 a.m. on June 25th, the guns fell silent. France's collapse was complete. In just 46 days, the Allies had lost nearly everything they had committed to the continent. The toll was staggering. French military deaths reached 90,000, with another 200,000 wounded. Nearly 1.8 million French soldiers, 1 in 10 adult men, became prisoners of war, marched east to camps across Germany. British losses totaled 68,000, including over 3,500 killed and more than 13,000 wounded. Belgium lost 23,350 men, the Netherlands nearly 9,800. The German army, despite its swift victory, counted 27,074 dead and over 110,000 wounded. In all, German casualties reached 156,000, proof that the campaign was costly even for the victors. The equipment losses gutted Allied armies. France lost more than 6,000 tanks and armoured vehicles, 2,000 destroyed in battle, another 4,000 captured and reused by the Germans. Over 892 French aircraft were lost, while the Luftwaffe sacrificed at least 1,200 planes and more than 1,100 aircrew. British forces abandoned 445 tanks, 2,400 artillery pieces, and nearly 65,000 vehicles in the chaos of Dunkirk and the retreat south. Ammunition, fuel, and supplies, hundreds of thousands of tons, were left behind or destroyed. Naval losses were severe as well. 6 British and 3 French destroyers were sunk during the evacuation, along with dozens of smaller craft. The scale of captivity was unprecedented. German records show that by the end of June, 1.8 million French soldiers were in German hands, including 120,000 colonial troops from North and West Africa, Madagascar, and Indochina. Most would remain prisoners until 1945. British and Belgian prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands, though the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force had escaped across the Channel. Colonial troops faced harsher fates. German racial policy dictated that black POWs be segregated in front stalags, denied Geneva Convention protections, and subjected to forced labor or summary execution. At least 1,000 to 1,500 black soldiers were murdered after surrender, most infamously at Chasselet, where tanks ran down Senegalese tirailleurs after machine gunning them in open fields. Civilian suffering reached historic levels. The German advance triggered the largest refugee crisis in Western Europe's history. Over 8 million people fled their homes in panic, clogging the roads south with carts, cars, and livestock. In Belgium, nearly a third of the population became refugees. The exodus left cities empty and the countryside overwhelmed, with authorities unable to provide food, shelter, or medical care. Thousands died on the road, victims of exhaustion, hunger, or German air attacks on columns mistaken for retreating troops. The campaign was scarred by atrocities. In the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, Wehrmacht and SS units massacred at least 500 civilians. At Wigny and Courrières, over 120 men, women and children were shot or burned alive. In Vingt, Belgium, 86 hostages were executed by the 225th Infantry Division. Elsewhere, villagers were used as human shields or killed in reprisal for resistance. The violence fell heaviest on French colonial soldiers. The Chasselet massacre claimed at least 50 black soldiers. Other killings at Erquinvilliers, Aubigny, and elsewhere brought the total to more than 1,000. These acts were not isolated but reflected official policy. German officers justified the murders on racial grounds, declaring that an inferior race does not deserve to do battle with a civilized race such as the Germans. The armistice terms divided France. Two-thirds of the country fell under German occupation, with the Atlantic coast, Paris, and the industrial north under direct military rule. The Vichy government, led by Pétain, retained nominal control in the south but answered to Berlin. The French fleet was disarmed, and overseas colonies were ordered to cease hostilities. More than 1 million French families faced years of separation from fathers, sons, and brothers held in Germany. The defeat left France shattered. Nearly 100,000 dead, 2 million prisoners, and a nation in ruins. The army that had once been Europe's strongest was gone. Its equipment lay abandoned or pressed into German service. The myth of French invincibility was erased, replaced by the hard reality of defeat and occupation. For Britain, now standing alone, the fall of France marked a new phase of the war. For the millions left behind, soldiers, refugees, and survivors, the armistice was not an end, but the beginning of a long, uncertain ordeal. In just 46 days, Germany defeated Allied armies that, on paper, outnumbered them by nearly 1 million men and over 1,000 tanks. Documents from both French and German archives confirmed that the campaign's outcome hinged less on equipment and more on leadership, planning, and the speed of operational decisions. The Allied commitment to Plan D, leaving the Ardennes weakly defended, and the Germans' rapid exploitation of this flaw are detailed in orders and diaries recovered after the armistice. Nearly 338,000 Allied troops escaped at Dunkirk, but over 1.5 million became prisoners of war. The fall of France in 1940 reshaped Europe and left Britain standing alone. The evidence shows that assumptions, not just weapons, decided the battle.